and death. That's not to be missed. And so when it withers, Jonah has it out with God. And he's like, I'm so angry I could die. I don't want to live anymore. How could you take this plant from me? And God is going, he says to Jonah, like, are you kidding? Do you know how many thousands of people are in this city that you don't care if they perish and all of their livestock and animals? You don't care about any of them. And you're grieving over this plant? And one of the things that comes out in Assyrian mythology, look at some of these images of what the Apkallu would do. You see them in all of these images, and they're carrying little buckets with one hand and pine cones in the other. And so what the Apkallu would do is they would stand around the tree of life. You see some of these images where they're standing around what the Assyrians called the tree of life. And they would take the bucket that was filled with waters from the mountains, and they would take the pine cone, and they would use the pine cone to sprinkle water on the tree of life, which rejuvenated and brought the crops and rejuvenated life for the empire. And what God is saying is, here's my Apkallu, Jonah, my fish man, and I give him a plant that's all about life and death, and he can't keep it from perishing. He's an inept Apkallu. He can't keep the tree of life and death alive. And so it's another message that life does not come from Jonah. Life comes from God. He is the one who sources it. He is the one who is sovereign over mercy to the Assyrians, sovereign over mercy to all the nations, including Israel and Judah. And so all of it is in his hands. Jonah, then, if we understand what the Assyrians believed about the Apkallu, and they believed he was an Apkallu, God is using that to show a message to the Assyrians that Jonah is a failed one.
So Jonah doesn't go back into the city.
Jonah never, if he does, we're not told about it. And judging on the way that the Assyrians are after the life of Jonah, I don't think they changed.
Okay, so we know that.
Yeah, so actually what happens, it's kind of a sad thing. So Jonah refuses to go in and be part of God's efforts to transform the Assyrian people. And so 2 generations later, the Assyrians in 722 BC will come through and they will conquer all of the tribes of northern Israel, including Jonah's descendants. And so they never turned. They went back to their old ways and all their cruelty, and they came through and they slaughtered the 10 tribes of northern Israel and took them off into exile. And it leaves you wondering, like, what would have been different if that one person who was called to love his enemies had done it? We'll never know, but it does make you wonder. One person could have changed history, rescued all of his descendants if he had just loved his enemies. And it makes you think, okay, who are my enemies? Who am I called to love? How could I change future generations if I just died to my own pride and loved those that are unlovely or unlovable?
That's kind of like the whole point of the show. Like, we look at cars like this that if an owner hadn't come by, seen something that was old, something that was broken, something that could have just been left on the side of the road and done something about it to in fact, like, resurrect this car back to the beautiful thing we see.
Yeah.
And so we all have that question.
I love that. You know, a lot of love was poured into this thing as it was falling apart and, in a sense, dying. And now it's been brought back to life and it's beautiful. And now it's the envy of everybody. Like, I want this. I can't afford it, but I want this. It's the envy of the world. It's made new. It's valuable. And that's kind of what we want to do with the show, right? So one of the other things that, you know, we talked about how Jesus is a greater Jonah. When Jesus comes along in the New Testament, it's made so absolutely crystal clear that that's what Jonah wants us to see. And the early church did see it. But there's a miracle that I'm sure you're familiar with, where the disciples are fishermen, right? So they're out in a boat. They're in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. And they're there because they're obedient, by the way. And all of a sudden, God hurls a storm on the sea. And it is a vicious storm. And the disciples are absolutely convinced that they're going to sink, that they're going to perish. And they're really upset with Jesus. Why? Because he's sleeping. Sound familiar?
Yeah.
Like, this is Jonah. He's a better than Jonah. And so they're freaking out like, hey, do you care that we're going to perish? Wake up. And Jesus wakes up, and it's meant to reveal something to us. He wakes up and he looks at the storm and the waves and the boat. If you've seen a first century boat, you remember when we went to the museum of what a first century boat looked like? Nope, I'm
Don't
not
feel
getting in
safe.
there on a good day. And now the storm is beating against it. And Jesus just looks up at the storm and he says, hush, peace, be still. And everything goes calm. Have we seen that before? Yeah, remember when they threw Jonah into the waters and on a dime, the storm stopped. And so Jesus stands up, says, peace, be still. He stops the storm and he's saying, yeah, I'm not just the one who's sleeping in the boat. I'm not just the Jonah figure of this story. I'm the one who commands the storm. I'm the one who looks at the clouds and the rain and the wind and the waves, and I say, stop, and they stop, which means I'm not just a man, though I am a man, I'm God. And so he sets himself apart from Jonah. And when the religious leaders came to him and they're like, we demand a sign, and you're like, you missed like so many signs. Feeding of the 5,000, the walking on water, the resurrection of Lazarus. There's so many signs. And they keep coming to him, demanding to know, like, by what authority are you telling us to do all these things? And Jesus gives this really powerful statement when he says, you know, this is such a wicked and adulterous generation. You give your hearts to anything and everything else. You're asking for a sign, but I'm only going to give you one sign. And it's the sign of Jonah, he says. And he says, for just as Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights, so too will the Son of Man, talking about himself, be in the grave for 3 days and 3 nights. And he's saying that was impossible, and yet God preserved life. You're actually going to put me to death, not just in a fish. I'm going to be dead. And 3 days later, I'm going to emerge alive. That's going to be the sign for you. And you know, the early church saw that as the sign of Jonah, and they reveled in it. They used it. If you go back to ossuary boxes that are first century, people buried before 70 AD, they would decorate their ossuaries with it's where you put your bones when you were dead and everything decayed. You'd keep your bones in the ossuary box. And they would decorate their ossuary box. And on some of the ossuary boxes, you see inscriptions to Jesus.
Okay.
Raise up, raise up. Divine Jehovah, raise up, raise up. On one of the ossuary boxes around the rim, you see the image of a little fishes again and again and again. Why? It's the symbol of the resurrection, the sign of Jonah, that the fish spit the man up after 3 days. When you see the little ichthus, the fish symbol on the back of cars, it's because we're people of resurrection. There was one ossuary box which literally had the image of a fish carved into it with a stick figure human being in the fish's mouth. Why? Because these people saw with their own eyes, perhaps, our Savior defeat death and raise from the dead. And he appeared to 500, we're told. And what did they do? When they died, they wanted that image on their coffins. Why? Because they wanted the power of the God who could raise Jonah from the sea, the power of the God who defeats death itself after 3 days in a tomb, and he gives the power of resurrection to all those who trust in him. He's so much better than Jonah.